from BBA 21 to deliver the welcome note. Well,
Good morning. Myself, Abel V. Wilson. Tell me, I forget. Teach me, I may remember. Involve me, I learn. The words from the great Benjamin Franklin. Yes, the learning happens through discussion and activities. This platform of Colloquia series is a space for such activities. First of the activity is presentation and discussion on nuances of governance in public system versus private system. For leading this discourse today, we have the director of IIM Raipur, Dr. Ram Kumar Kakkani, who has still live roots in IIM Kozhikode. The resourceful academician who started his career from corporate world and has a splendid academic life in various institutions across the globe, be it Denmark, Nigeria, Singapore, or at the UAE. A prolific author has a connection with the most reputed publishing house, has found his niche in the area of leadership and governance. His presence here is the boom of the day. It is an honor to welcome a dignitary of his stature on the behalf of our institution. Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
Along with I welcome all the teaching and non-teaching staffs and the student fraternity. My dear friends, all are welcome this great opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you. Should I
forum is
start?
open to you. Please, sir.
Okay.
Open
Okay.
to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Abel, for such a lovely introduction. Honored to be part of this. And it's very rare that your own teacher is asking you to do something and you accept it. So let me put it this way that my mentor, my teacher, Professor N. Ramachandran, and my co-author, and in some sense, who also guided me during some of my tough times of my PhD, uh, in some sense, is part of DC School of Management, and it'll be my, you can say, mistake if I do not acknowledge his contribution to whatever little bit I am today. So I think I can see a lot of nicely dressed friends out there in a place, and thank you so much for getting ready at such a you can say nice morning on a Saturday morning and being there. Thank you so much, friends, and it's fun to kind of see so many out there being dressed, and I hope I'll get a chance to meet some of you. And thank you for such a lovely follow-up, Elizabeth Madam, and to ensure that everything kind of gets going in a systematic fashion. Friends, I am doing this particular session from my office room. In that sense, if there is a buzz or two, does not mean anything wrong. It is just that since I am seated in my office, there could be a ring or two. That doesn't mean that I'm not focused. We'll try to do as good a job as feasible, and to the extent we'll ensure a seamless kind of uh, you can say question answer session as well. I'll spend about 30 to 40 minutes in terms of the nuances of governance, and then we'll move towards Q&A, which could result in some, you can say, nice interactions as well. Because I would like to have the session as interactive as feasible. So, one second, just how do I share my presentation? Sir, can you help me? I think share. Okay. Can you help me in giving rights of sharing a PowerPoint presentation if it's fine with you?
Yes, sir. One second. One second.
Okay. I think you've given me rights. Wonderful. So, yeah. So, friends, the topic for the day is essentially nuances of governance in public systems versus private systems. So, let's first understand what are some of these words out there, and then we will try to slowly, steadily delve into how these words get complicated in the real life. And of course, the idea is the more we appreciate the nuances of these complications, the more I think we appreciate the issues related to governance and about the topic itself. I think it goes without saying that we are all learning from each other, and in that sense, your inputs, your questions would be kind of welcome at the end of the session. So, without taking much time, the first and foremost item comes is what's this word governance? Governance essentially is the way rules, norms, and actions are structured, sustained, regulated, used or misused, and held accountable. Hmm? So, if you observe, there are a lot of terms that are being mentioned. Of course, one way to do governance is government, and another way to say is we don't need governance. For example, take a family of four or five people you're staying together, let's say with your parents. There's a way that is being governed at the home, the way things are happening. So that's another continuum of the governance. So we are trying to say there are two ways of governance. One is and however the what is important is that governance essentially is the way rules, norms, actions are structured, sustained, regulated, and used or misused. So you might say that, okay, I'm reading. So let me give you an example of it. The degree of formality depends on the internal rules of a given organization. For example, in a large government organization, the degree of internal rules would be very kind of hierarchical, would be fairly detailed. Imagine a family-based firm, let's say something which is running a bakery in Vagamon. Essentially, the internal rules, the degree of formality may be very less, and the internal rules of the given organization would be extremely less. One part. And the second part of what I'm trying to say also depends on the business partners and the other external stakeholders who matter. For example, in the case of a government, the external stakeholders are Hajar, and that is are many. And you would agree that the nature of the external stakeholders can be very diverse, very wide, and their power centers also are highly unpredictable. The way things may happen can be very drastically different. To give you an example, let's say land acquisition of Palghat in Palghat of a railway station, something for a railway coach factory. Some of you who may have read newspapers may have come across this particular issue about 10 to 15 years back. Now, when it comes to this kind of an issue, you would agree that you would possibly say that, okay, we understand, and we know that how drastically the dynamics of the land acquisition changes the moment you can say the factors kind of the moment the factors change, or the moment, let's say, the local protests happen, the moment the local politician, let's say, changes his stance from X to Y. Hmm? That is one part of it. The other is, if you observe our example of a family-based bakery firm in and around Vagamon, or some kind of family business out there, who are the business partners? Possibly some of the local community members out there. And who are the other external stakeholders? A bit of government and a bit of, let's say, local, state, and municipality rules that are there, municipal rules that are there. So if you observe, what I am trying to say is governance is the way rules, norms, and actions are structured. And I'm saying on one side you have private governance. Private governance, for us, the example here is a family-based bakery in Vagamon. That's just one illustration I'm giving. You can even think of Reliance Industries out there, which is again, you would agree to a large extent, it is a family-based business organization. It's a business group. The other part I am trying to say is public governance. Within public governance, I am giving you an illustration of the dynamics of, let's say, how a district administration, how a collector functions, let's say, for a land acquisition, and the factors he is dealing with it. You'd agree that the internal rules here would be far and wide. hmm? That is in the case of public governance. And you would also agree that The number of external stakeholders are very wide and highly unpredictable, and things can become a little dynamic at the last moment also. I'd given you an example of the land acquisition of railway coach factory in Palghat district. On the other side, we are saying on this side, things would be exactly opposite. What we are essentially trying to say is the internal rules can be very quickly, you can say, changed. There are hardly any internal rules in, let's say, the smaller a family-based organization or even a corporate is, and more or less things are fairly predictable. And when things are fairly predictable and other external stakeholders are also very less to deal with. And in that sense, private governance, you would agree, is relatively speaking far more less complicated, and the dynamics of it will not change as drastically as we just pointed out in the world of public governance. That was one part of it. And we are also essentially trying to say, in other words, governance is not an isolated process. It's not an isolated process. It's got various forms. It's driven by different motivations producing dissimilar results. Now, what I mean to say is, now you can always say this guy's given one more word, motivations. So let me ask you a simple question. What is it that the private sector or private governance is driven by? You would agree it is typically driven by profit. And how does profit get measured in a larger context? We possibly look at it as efficiency. Efficiency means output divided by input. The higher the output, the lesser the input. Will say, wow, return on equity is great, or wow, the productivity is great, or wow, the capacity utilization is fantastic. So these are the things which are. So efficiency is the primary driver in primary motivation in a private governance. Now let's move to the other continuum, public governance. Efficiency is one motive out there, but if you observe governments and organizations within governance, let's say an army, or let's say a district dealing with disaster kind of a situation, or government of India handling the COVID situation, their efficiency might be one particular metric you may start with. Remember, I defined efficiency as output divided by input. But you would agree that in real life, they are guided by the constitution of the government that is there, like Constitution of India, which was created by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, and wherein we kind of say that, look, India is a so and so kind of a nation, right? In other words, efficiency might be the number one metric which you might be thinking about, because if you think of, let's say, a small scheme like, let's say, a government running a small program or issuing Aadhaar card, they might go with the least cost one. And hence, I agree with some of you if you kind of say that, look, efficiency is also here a primary motivation by which the governance of a public organization is driven by. But you would also agree that as the challenges increase, it is the effectiveness also. For example, if a COVID strikes or if a disaster situation is there, then it is driven by effectiveness. What is the difference between effectiveness and efficiency? Effectiveness is essentially driven by how much of the goals that you have set are being met. So the second level is essentially here we are talking about effectiveness, which is a level higher than efficiency. Efficiency was bothered about how much output vis-a-vis input. When it comes to effectiveness, input is not at all a big issue out there. For example, to control COVID after when pushed to a corner or in a disaster kind of a situation, governments are not bothered about how much will be the cost of controlling so and so. They will say, okay, we'll go ahead and take it, come what may. In other words, they are driven by effectiveness. Effectiveness is a level above efficiency, the way I am kind of answering. Now, if you observe how are the, you can say, transnational, that is across the world, how are these public governances taken into account, then you would see that they are taken into account and they are driven by what we call as what we call as essentially transnational economic governance. For example, United Nations. What's United Nations? It's essentially a community of multiple nations coming together. And there you would typically observe United Nations is not driven by efficiency, not driven by effectiveness. In fact, the motivations, if you typically observe, are sustainability. For example, many of you may have heard UN is driven towards 17 SDGs, Millennium's SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. Now, if some of you have spent some time on these SDGs, you would also agree that these sustainable development goals created by United Nations, agreed by UN, and agreed by all the countries out there is largely driven by anthropocentric sustainability. In other words, sustainability which is more concerned about human beings, which is not bothered about non-human beings. For example, a small flora, fauna, a stone which is there, United Nations won't be bothered about it. So the a motivation level above effectiveness I am talking about is anthropocentric sustainability. And a motivation above that, which we call as sustainability in the real, you can say in an idealistic sense, is what we can call as all systems sustainability. So, friends, I'm saying public systems, when you look at it, we started by efficiency, then we moved to effectiveness, then we moved to anthropocentric sustainability. Then we are saying, look, in an idealistic situations, a government or a transnational government out there or organizations like United Nations should be thinking about all systems sustainability. They should not be guided by what human beings want. They should be guided by what almost all living and non-living things want. One part of it. Now, when it comes to the private systems out there, we are saying private systems are governed by efficiency. Now, some of you can say, no, 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 they are not driven only by efficiency. Look at Google, look at Facebook. Google, Facebook, or Amazon, or all these, you can say Meta, and all these kind of things which are coming are also driven by efficiency. But the idea is they want to make future profits, and in that sense, it's driven by future efficiency. In that sense, it is driven by future efficiency. And what I'm trying to say is we started by saying, look, a bakery factory is kind of keen on profitability now. But if a bakery, if a bakery shop or a Reliance Industries or any kind of entity out there, or even a startup out there thinking about something big, we'll say, let me think about the, let's say, some sort of a social media world, or the world out there which we can think of 20 years or 30 years down the line, and let me create future efficiency, and hence they'll be creating some sort of a disruptive innovation out there. So we are saying that, look, the motivations are different, but we understand some of the various forms of motivations that are there in both the aspects. Now, governing is not at all an isolated process. And what we mean to say is, it's if it is not isolated, what are we trying to say? We are saying that external actors matter a lot. For example, army. The external actors in the public systems are different in a place like army. Another example I'll give you, the district administration. The external stakeholders are different. Take one more example. For example, the organizations such as Marine Promotion Export Development Council, MPEDA, I think, something like that, which is Government of India's initiative, which is driven by how can we promote exports and who are going to do these exports? The private governance guys out there. Hmm? Now, I'm saying the public systems, the external actors are very wide, and they're you might say it's a politician X or a politician Y, but if you observe the kind of nuances and the dynamics that are there are very different. In other words, the human social relations on this side are, relatively speaking, complicated, dynamic. It is not that one political person will live for life, or it is not that one external stakeholder will define the nuance contours of this game on this side for life. Now, let us go to the other side of the world. Hmm? In private systems, if you observe, while we might think the private sector is, you can say, all clean or whatever, because some of you might be aiming for placements in the private sector. Permit me to kind of share this small, you can say, nuance out there or small difference of opinion I have on this particular aspect. You would agree that even private governance is driven by kinships, relationships, and a bit of networks out there. In other words, the human and social relationships do matter. Fine, the level of complications may not be as much as this, but it is driven by kinship. Kinship, you would agree that in a family-based organization, let's say something which is managed within the family, take any group which is big in Kerala. For example, you got this Ajad Mupan group, or you got this many groups out there, AVT and MRF, and all these kind of groups that are there. You typically see that this side is has a fair bit of influence of the kinship aspect as well. Hmm? It is not that everything is done professionally, the way, whatever in an idealistic world you would like to be. What are we trying to say? We are trying to say, look here, the power relations will differ in this place and this place. In this place, typically, that is in the on the side of the private governance, what typically happens is we presume that there will be perfect markets and there will be a market clearing mechanism which will drive efficient decision making. In other words, we are thinking that in a real world, there'll be lot of perfect competition wherein firms will fight with each other, firms can hire anyone, there are no transaction costs, and it's perfect markets. And in that sense, everything will be towards what we call as the efficient markets. If some of you had kind of gone through those capital markets, three levels of efficiency, I'm talking of strong form of efficiency of markets out there. Whereas you would agree that in real life, corporates are not at all. The private systems out there or market clearing mechanism is not as perfect as we may like it to be. In reality, you have monopolies. You have Coca-Colas and HULs, Hindustan Unilevers of the world, which are playing a game like Gillette, for example. They know how to create a certain segment and ensure that nobody enters that particular segment. And they are totally kind of very, very solid when it comes to playing what I call as strategies of defense. And they know how to protect their turf. Not only they know how to protect their turf, they know how to increase that particular turf also. For example, they will say, look, shaving, for example, let's say shaving blade. They might initially say it's good for males, then they'll say, look, it's good for other things which possibly males might need, not just a shave, which possibly they'll, or not just trimming. Then they'll say, look, there are other uses which every gender can kind of look at and make use of it. And that's how Gillette's got a market share of over 50%. My gut feel is it's about 70 to 80% of that particular segment. And they're even growing that particular market seamlessly without creating any news or waves out there. Hmm? And I'm sure you can talk to your friends out there and you would realize that yes, in reality, almost all of you might be using some sort of a Gillette or the other one out there. So that's how public systems are here. Hmm? Now, when it comes to the I'm sorry, private systems are on this side. We're saying private systems, it is primarily driven by market clearing mechanism, wherein government thinks it will create competition, it will reduce transaction costs, and these reduction in transactions costs and perfect markets would lead to no one player having kind of position and pole position or trying to earn abnormal returns. However, corporates, with their own judgment and the way they've been playing the game, have been able to create their own niches. And I'm not criticizing them on why. For example, I'm not saying Gillette is doing wrong. If I were to be the CEO or manager of Gillette, I'm sure I would also have been driven by the goal of efficiency, profitability, and future profitability. And I would have also exactly done what they are doing. And I would create a 70 to 80% market share and have a monopoly seamlessly without disturbing, without ensuring that no other player kind of captures that particular segment. And finding using those porters, five forces model, etc., to ensure that these things are muted. That's one part. Now let us go to the other side. Uh, when it comes to public systems, friends, public systems are typically observe army, observe any kind of government office. It is driven by hierarchy. What I'm indirectly trying to say is there is in both the corners out there. Hierarchy means what? In an army, the major will tell something to someone below him and someone below him, and that has to be followed. Similarly, in a government office, the clerk will be told something by the you can say head clerk, and head clerk will also be kind of given instruction by someone above him, etc., etc. And you have to follow it. That is where they think that decision making will be perfect. In other words, on this side also, if you observe, there are implicit assumptions, and these implicit assumptions may once in a while get violated. For example, there is an implicit assumption that the clerk knows less and it is less informed and less intelligent than the head clerk. And for example, there is a relatively implicit assumption that head clerk not only just has all the powers, but is more informed and more, you can say, has better sense of what the game is. And in that sense, he says, do this, and the clerk has to do that. Similarly, a collector will say something to the sub collector will say something to someone else, etc., etc. So there is an implicit assumption that the guy at the top in the public governance possibly has to be the most well informed, A, and his world of advisors, people around him also have to kind of be very, very smart in what advice they are giving. And that is how the information keeps happening. So you would agree that both the parts are fairly kind of different out there, and there are challenges out there. Now, if you observe in both the cases a little bit, if you can spend time, you would observe that both the places, the structuring of the game or structuring of these public and private systems, the extreme continents, are driven by distrust. For example, there is a distrust that if I delegate to someone on the public systems, he may take a wrong decision. Hmm? The trust factor, the sense of interdependence is relatively low. There is distrust, there is competition, there is rivalry, and things are contractual in nature. Same in a private sector, if you observe, the way we kind of create multiple firms, we say that you please compete with each other, you kind of fight it out, etc., etc. It the sense of interdependence here also is low. What we mean to say is there is distrust, there is competition between firms, there is rivalry even inside the firms that are there. Let's say I and you are working in TCS, we definitely compete with each other, and the relations are contractual in nature. No, so that essentially explains this particular debate discussion which we are having. Let me move a little further. Now, so what you can observe is you would agree that just a second. I think how do I? What we are essentially trying to say is there are organization continuum issues as well. Now, what I mean by organization continuum issues, for example, when it comes to the private sector, in your space, you may have been only thinking about the joint liability companies like Reliance Industries, Gillette, etc., etc. But if you see in real life, the private organizations can be OPC, one person company, can be LLP, limited liability partnership, can be partnership, that is general partnership, can be private limited, can be public limited, can be guaranteed company also. So the organization continuum itself can be very, very wide and complicated. We only thought that the game is largely restricted to public limited for profit entities, but in reality, if you observe these, there is a wide range out there. And you would agree that most of this is driven by the notion of the capital and wealth is financial capital and material wealth. In the on this side of the public systems, relatively speaking, organization types are relatively limited, but and most of it is hierarchical in nature, whether it is army or district or even United Nations or all those structures are relatively speaking top down, and that is how things are. Now the question comes, what am I trying to kind of debate, discuss by doing all this drama about look public systems and private systems? There are two extremes. If you see the real life, there are lot of organizations and lot of things that are there in the middle, and which is where I'm saying there is a governance continuum. This governance continuum, things in the middle, are driven by governances which are community-based governance. Think of Amul, it is community-based governance. Think of many community-based organizations such as Brahma Kumaris, or I'm sure many of you might be aware of those missionary organizations, etc. You would typically see them being in the middle. They are driven by network-based governance which is driven by relationships. This middle part is often in the world of governance, we call it as they are governed by collaborative governance, mandated cooperative governance, mandated governance. That is, government is mandating that you please create a cooperative and run it like this. But it is in the middle here. And there are many kind of governances, but the idea here is in the middle, it is largely driven by networks and relationships. What do we mean by that? We mean if you observe organizations in the middle, the sense of interdependence is very high. That is, if I and you were part of an organization which is in the middle, which is driven by a certain community and its agenda, whatever might be the region, religion, or whatever it is, take an Amul also, the sense of interdependence would be very high. We will trust each other, we'll cooperate with each other, we'll kind of be friendly with each other, and our relationship will be non-contractual. Another example I'll give you is FPOs, farmer producer organizations. They also come in the middle. And typically, these organizations in the middle, even the caste or religious based groupings that you might think of, things which are driven by what I call as professional identity groupings like ICAI or the medical association that is there, the Association of Doctors. That is ICAI is essentially a professional grouping based on the chartered accountants out there, or even the social identity based gatherings that are there. Let's say the association of XYZ caste community, whatever it might be, or a region, let's say all the Buddhists of India, whatever you might call them. There, the notion of capital and wealth, what is it that is driving each other? They are driven by social capital and social wealth. For example, a community of Gujarati businessmen out there in Kochi. Why do they all stay together and live in a particular area of Cochin out there? I'm sure most of you, when you visit Cochin, you would observe that there'll be one particular Gujarat school which will be talking about the Gujarati language. There'll be a certain, you can say, a few shops related to Gujarati, etc. It is because the notion of what is driving them is they want to be together, social capital, social wealth. So we are saying on these two ends, we spoke about a few things. In the middle, essentially lies the bigger part, which is the non-measured part, which is the what I call as driven by network-based governances that are there. So that's something which I think I wanted to point out. Then what else? I think, of course, if when we talk about corporate governance in the world of private sector, we might be thinking of only the Microsofts and Googles of the world when you go to the classroom, that is the type one. But in reality, when you see even within corporate governance of the private sector, if you observe, there are more than over 9 types of corporate governances that could be there. To give you some examples out there, dispersed ownership in India could be an ITC or a LNT, or a HDFC. Concentrated ownership, I'm sure you would agree, a Torrent or some of those organizations with huge control of the family like MRF will come in number two. And I'm sure there are enough examples related to number 3 to 9. Hmm? You will have to just spend some time and you will realize that even within the private governance, that too restricted to corporate governance only, the world can be very, very different depending on the nature of ownership that is there. Hmm? Of course, I can keep talking about all these things, but I think I would like to kind of pick up these things only if there is a need for it. Hmm? So all of this essentially leads to some sort of issues of decoupling, and all of this essentially also lead to issues ensuring the difference between the public and private systems. You see, you would observe that all these differences are also driven by the stakeholder engagement continuums that are there. Now, what am I trying to say? I'm trying to say here that is the number of stakeholders who are there. You would agree that stakeholder means anyone who has power, urgency, legitimacy. Power, urgency, legitimacy. That is, if any one of these there is a tick mark, then typically he becomes a stakeholder. That's what Michel's 1997 framework, Michel et al. 1997 kind of framework talks about. Hmm? So that's essentially the stakeholder engagement continuum issues that are there. Now, when it comes to what do we measure and what do we showcase, for example, in a world of private systems, it is largely driven by only stock market and the indices. In other words, when it comes to the distribution issues, the distribution is typically restricted to, that is, the metric is largely only measure the wealth of the shareholders, that is the equity part, and within that also measure only the wealth of those 40, 50 listed companies and keep giving the indices that are there. And in that sense, there is also a bit of pressure from social capital driven biases. What do I mean by social capital driven biases? You will never see the voices and the wealth that is being created by even within the private sector by other organizations, because the larger corporates, the bigger ones, drive the agenda out there. So that's the social capital bias out there. And those are the kind of issues that will be there. So, of course, what are the ways ahead in which kind of some of these in the middle kind of segment gets captured, which we were talking about governance, which is in the middle, driven by collaborative governance, cooperative governance, mandated governance, community-based governance, network-based governance. So I think one way out there is possibly look at creating a social stock exchange. If you create a social stock exchange, which is, I think, in India a work in progress, already the government is on that particular mission. That's one way to ensure that this in the middle category segment essentially gets captured. One part. Second is, I think, possibly also looking at converging the informal to formal, that is, converting slowly, steadily the sector whose indicators have not been captured, which is informal, let's say small bakery in Vagamon, which is what we said. Can we find ways and means such that it is part of some stock exchange and its market will be captured? Or can we kind of find ways such that at least it registers itself as a limited liability entity and it kind of pays GST and it automatically the amount of business being done by it gets captured by the formal economic systems that are there. Hmm? So I think the other part is another way in which the government may like to kind of find ways and means to measure this in the middle segment. Definitely measuring the kind of things which are being done by, let's say, some of these community-based organizations or some of these religious organizations, such as a certain Brahma Kumaris or whatever it is, or various kind of organizations that are there. They might be doing wonderful. Capturing them into a certain metric is difficult. But ensuring that they get converted into informal to formal world is possibly a far superior way out and ensuring that they get captured. I think I am done with this particular discussion and let me stop sharing and I'd be happy to take up the questions that might be there and I'll be happy to answer some of them as well. Yeah, oh, looks like I've spent some time out there, maybe 40 minutes, 45 minutes, I don't know.
It was really fantastic, and we are not done with the discussion. Actually, the discussion is on. We have students who would like to discuss. Yes, dear students, the forum is open to you. You have a stalwart in governance of you. Please be open.
Good morning, sir.
Yeah. Good morning.
So I'm Kenny. So my first question is, so do you think leadership can influence governance?
Leadership hugely influences governance. In fact, the way things get done it's a fantastic question. I think it's a good question, and definitely the way leadership is contoured and created definitely will also define the. So to give you a certain example here, Rian, the way I'd possibly put it is that you see, one way is how the game is documented. For example, we in India are driven by Westminster Parliament kind of a system when it comes to the public systems. Same might be the case with another country which also says, like Singapore also will say, we are a democracy out there. But you would agree that the level of democracy which kind of is in real life there is possibly, I think, one-sided. It's not democracy in the truest of the sense compared to a nation such as India. So leadership does define, and perhaps they've found and they've sorted out a way in which they ensure that the same political party and the same, you can say, dynasty in some sense keeps winning the elections more than 50 years out there. That itself shows that there is a certain while they might easily say we are a democratic nation, but you would agree that the democracy there is fairly kind of managed, and that's being possible. Definitely, you would agree that that's managed by the leadership out there. The one who sets the rules of the game also knows, you would agree, has better chances to win the game. Now comes similarly in the private sector, if you observe, I'm sure you would see substantial difference between, let's say, a Reliance being managed vis-a-vis Infosys being managed.
Thank you, sir. So what about the responsibility in private and public sector? If any legal issues or any other cases come, so how is the responsibility held in both sectors?
So you would observe that private sector, while it can grow bigger and bigger, the one which sets the rules of the game is largely the government out there. And in other words, the central, state, and local administrative authorities will to a large extent define the contours of the game. What I'm trying to say here, Rion, indirectly is Shell, for example, the company Shell in Netherlands, it constitutes over 40% of the market capitalization of the total wealth of Netherlands itself. Hmm? Uh, but while one can say that, look, in other words, Shell company and the folks managing Shell company can design and define who will be the politician of Netherlands and who will become prime minister, who will become the, you can say, the leader out there and who will take decisions. The reality is no. It is the state, local governments, and central governments who have created an ecosystem, and they are the ones who have ensured that Shell grows bigger and bigger to the extent of 40% of the size of the economy of the nation itself. So I think to a large extent it is defined by the norms that are created, and norms in real life are created by the public systems and the organizations that are there. Indirectly, often I keep saying that you see the intangible things in the world are the more important things. Guys in marketing would possibly agree to it. What I'm indirectly trying to say here is, if there were no district administration, or let's say if rules in India were changed the way, let's say, Nigeria or some of the African states get managed, you would agree that there will be utter chaos. People will kind of, so we do not appreciate and acknowledge how smooth our systems are, district administration are. And only when there is a communal violence or only when there is a huge disaster happening, we realize and understand how important these organizations are. For example, COVID to a large extent may have made you realize the powers that government servants would have and the public systems can make. So that's one example I'm trying to give you here. So what indirectly I'm saying, public systems is relatively invisible. You may not valorize them, but please understand intangible things of a nation and the context setting is done by these guys. I'm done.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
So my name is Ruben Raju. So my question is, as public sector companies have many social obligation, is it right to measure them with profit compared to private sector companies?
Yeah, it's a nice question, and I'm sure our discussion might have made you answer this also to a certain extent that, look, you can't measure NTPC or Indian Oil based on the wealth that they are creating, because more than half of the times they have to handle the number of requests and requirements that the government norms would have. To just give you an example, I'm kind of head of a government organization, and definitely my counterpart would be some director of a private business school of equal size. But if you observe, almost every week, my office might be receiving about 10 to 20 kind of norms and requirements that we need to meet from the government. And we respect that part also. You see, finally, we are part of the nation, and in that sense, we respect and we try to adhere to them. For example, they will say, look, for example, we kind of have to ensure the SC/ST, for example, constitutes our faculty community, our student community, etc. We have to ensure that the disabled, that is what we call these days as Divyang, that is the relatively speaking, that is physically challenged out there, need to be given representation in almost all the ecosystems and places out there, and we try to do that. And in that sense, our performance has to be constrained or compromised out there. Same is the case with public sector units also. Vis-a-vis a private organization such as Infosys or any competitor of NTPC out there like Adani Power, Tata Power, etc. out there. Definitely the number of norms and things that they have to factor in would be far lesser. As a result, you will typically see many of the private sector organizations doing far superior in the banking sector, whereas most of the banks, public sector banks, often are not able to do well and need capitalization to survive and keep going. Possibly because of the norms and the definitely multiple goals which they have to meet. That makes the game far more complicated.
Thank you, sir.
So just now you mentioned the bank, especially private bank. Does it end crisis is problem of governance?
Sir, I'm not able to your. Maybe you can put the mic a little.
I shall. Am I
Thank
audible,
you.
sir?
Yeah, yeah.
Sir, just now you mentioned the private banks against the public banks, nationalized banks. So does that mean that the NPA crisis that we are facing right now is a result of governance failure?
It is a result of the governance combined with the number of norms being. See, if you observe, one part of our discussion was motivations. What are the motivations of a private systems vis-a-vis public systems? In a private system such as HDFC Bank or a Kotak Mahindra Bank, the target would be ensure a return on equity today and in future and let it keep growing. That essentially is the primary driver. The shareholders will define how the organization has to be run. Here, if you observe in a bank, which is, let's say, Central Bank of India or a Canara Bank, which is owned by the government to a large extent, the contours of the game, that is, the motivations are not single. There are, as I pointed out, we get almost 10 to 20 different indicators almost every week saying you please meet these things. Which, in other words, it's not driven only by ROE today or ROE in future. It's also driven by, for example, I'm sure a CEO of Canara Bank has to kind of spend nearly 30 to 40% of the time in terms of meeting some of these norms of the organization and the requirements of the organization because their primary owner is government. And so, strictly speaking, it is not driven by the goal of wealth maximization. It is wealth maximization is one goal, but they are driven by other, you can say, issues as well, other motivations as well, which are primarily being created by the government itself. Right.
Good morning, sir.
Yes,
I am Gerald James.
Yeah.
And my question is regarding the liberalization and globalization policies of India. So, sir, many MNCs have influenced the Indian government in decision making.
Okay.
And the enormous funding of MNCs has further caused government to rely over these corporations. So it has got an adverse effect over our national security in many ways. and the society can be even exploited further. So,
Right.
what is your stance regarding this matter?
It's a very complicated question to start with, and I would say this may not be the floor or fora to answer it, but the way I'll put it is there an alternate solution to it? Would you or I, have we been heading the nation at that particular point in time? Did we have a choice or did we have a decision-making power which was a little different from what, let's say, the nation has been taking and going through? Perhaps in hindsight, we might say it was there, etc. But you would possibly agree that we need to give the benefit of doubt to the people who took decisions at that particular point in time. In other words, you see, it's like LBW decision. So I think you can possibly say it's out only when you have concrete proof that there were other options that were available, which were better, but which were not opted for. Hmm? Uh, so that is where I would possibly say that at this time, at this point, saying that we've been exploited, or let's say the multinationals have in some sense done something which possibly was possibly in some sense not in the best interest of the nation. Perhaps true, but is there an alternate answer to it? Strictly speaking, I'll go to the extent of saying that maybe there are not many alternatives at that point in time. And A and B, I think I'd also possibly park this question by saying, look, strictly speaking, I'm not an economist out there. I'm someone who's picked a little bit of finance, little bit of leadership, little bit of governance. So in that sense, I may not have the right expertise to elaborate on this also further.
Sir.
Thank you.
Sir, I want to ask a question again.
Yeah.
Air India, which was recently auctioned off, was a public sector company,
Right.
which was kept as a company, Tata Sons. Was it a problem with governance?
It was a combination of both the factors. It is a combination of governance, plus you would agree that Air India's primary aim or Indian Railways' primary aim is not wealth maximization, neither today nor in future. So strictly speaking, you can never measure an Air India or a Indian Airlines from the benchmarks which the private sector has created for itself. You will have to understand that most nations across the globe during the last century, that is 1900 to 2000, had their own private airline. I'm sorry, had their own airline to ensure that there was a transport for the government itself and the government officials itself. And you would agree that it was also to kind of kickstart that particular sector in that particular nation. Today, now that the government has been able to create a vibrant private sector wherein there are 4 to 5 private airline companies which are competing with each other, and there are 1 to 2 new guys coming into play, definitely now Air India is a liability, and government thinks we can always own 1 to 2 aircrafts of our own. We don't need Air India services for flying our own, you can say, officials and bureaucrats out there. And in that sense, they have said, okay, let us sell it off. So it's like during 1900 to 2000, you possibly needed an airline of your own as a government, and hence, even though it was making losses, it was perfectly okay. But now, in the context of 2010 onwards, you're correct, Riven, that maybe they could have done sold it a little earlier. But I'm sure in the government, the paperwork is not easy as said. There are a lot of norms you have to meet. And only after those norms and conditions are met, decisions get taken. To give you a quick example, even a small change in my HR policy here would possibly take about 2 to 4 months inside my organization. Whereas in a private sector, it's just a matter of calling the personal secretary saying, please write this note and saying, please get this going. So it's matter of possibly one day at the most in a private sector organization wherein the hierarchy is very clearly defined and wherein it is clearly told you take decisions.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Adding to that particular argument, is it just the liability argument, or uh, has it a political angle? I mean, the policy-wise angle as well, because it's not just Air India. I mean, this week we have the LIC stocks also under the
Yeah.
hammer. So, I mean,
Yeah.
LIC is never a liability. Again, there is a policy-wise angle as well into it, I suppose.
You are correct. There is a policy-wise angle as well, and perhaps government is trying to find ways and means such that both the private forces and the other forces are met. See, some of those internal needs perhaps are also forcing their own way. But perhaps it is possibly correct also. If you ask me, with thriving private sector insurance companies out there and with a regulator such as the IRDAI or whatever insurance regulator out there, I'm sure there is the need for LIC to be on its own as an act of parliament may not be as much as it would have been possibly 50 years back. You're correct, sir.
So,
Yes,
so
sir.
last December during the Christmas vacation, just before the Christmas vacation season, Better.com, a mortgage-based company, its CEO Vishal Garg laid off around 9 to 15% of its company's employees just through over a Zoom conference. And after a few months, I think around March 2022, they're planning to do the third round of firing their employees. So this case shows a huge threat to employees in private sector governance. So what's your opinion on this case?
Whenever it comes to survival of the organization, don't you think such extreme decisions will have to be taken? Had it been a nation also, for example, Ukraine, pushed to a corner, it will say, forget efficiency, forget low cost, let's focus on ensuring that we survive. And perhaps the situation is possibly coming because the business model which they had been created is not kind of to the expectations that they initially had drafted it out. So you're correct, Rian, there are issues in private sector. But the way I defended the public sector, I'd possibly say that we'll have to think what we could have done had we been in their seat at that particular point in time. You see, the information set which I and you have, Rian, is not as much as the people inside the organization, whether it is Vishal Garg or someone else, may be having at that particular point in time, right? So, from far away, yes, definitely what you say is 100% correct. I'm not denying what you're saying, but I think we possibly may say that there is a need to know a little more behind what has forced them to take that particular decision. To give you a very quick example, Rian, in the private sector, when you get funded by some of these organizations that are there, that is in terms of the seed capital, etc., that come to you. What happens is there are a lot of restrictions which you have to sign. There are a lot of terms and conditions which you have to sign. I remember being associated with a small startup company, and the promoter of Hotmail, Sabir Bhatia, in those days said he will fund. But when we read the term sheet, we said we don't need this money at all because the term sheet was clearly saying in case you do not survive in the next 5 years, etc., then you would. It was essentially trying to say the one who founded it, my own student. I think his name was Ravi. The term sheet was asking him to kind of work in the organization and repay till the firm. I mean, it was as good as asking the that particular guy to be a bonded labor of that particular organization at zero salary, which you would agree is not practical. So we'll have to go through what are the term sheets of this Vishal Garg firm which you are pointing out, and we might then make a better sense of what is driving that particular decision. Yes, prima facie, from the outside world, you and I can make out that there seems to be something wrong.
In that particular case, what about this anthropocentric sustainability of this corporate governance? Don't they need?
That's a very wonderful question. They need, and perhaps the more we make them aware of these issues, some of them might just move towards that. See, the more and more awareness we create, the more and more people are more aware. I'm sure the corporate world and the private sector will also be forced to think on those lines. So, sir, I'll put it this way that if you observe countries which are in Scandinavia, I'm sorry, firms and countries such as Scandinavian firms and Scandinavian organizations that are there, they are far more oriented towards anthropocentric sustainability than people like you and me and our own kind of ways in looking at it, things, because their awareness levels are far superior and they have spent fair amount of time in terms of saying how do we resolve it. So perhaps it's a matter of another 10 to 15 years for us to move towards that level. Thank you. I think
Is it just about the awareness level, or rather it is a culture which drives
Yeah,
this?
culture also is there, but the more, what I'm indirectly trying to say, sir, is that the more is the awareness, the more and more awareness we create and have debates, discussions oriented towards these issues, slowly, steadily, people will move towards it. Like, you would agree that 10 to 20 years back, we would not even think of what are electric vehicles, but suddenly you see both the government and people around seem to be suddenly saying, no, no, there is a need for EVs, etc. Right. So I think it's more about ensuring that the discourse itself gets moved, gets shifted.
Definitely, sir, definitely. A huge lot of students are waiting there in the hall. I think some of them would definitely have some serious questions. I think this is a great opportunity for you to interact with uh, such a stalwart in this field. Anyone?
So what happens is when there are a lot of people, Nasser, there is a hesitancy to ask because nobody would like to be seen on the wrong side of the rest of the friends out there. Else they will be taken care of by the rest of the friends.
Again, that's where the leadership
Yeah,
origin.
yeah, I agree.
See if we have some gutsy people out there can speak. Director of IIM Raipur. Yes, students, come up, please.
Hello, sir.
Yeah, Rian, tell me.
So what are the challenges faced by public sector? Because in public sector, they should keep their public happy and as well as they should make profit. So how do they balance both?
I guess they are balanced. They balance both by ensuring more larger discussion and larger kind of community-based engagement and larger consultation with the community, both inside and outside. For example, to give you a very quick example, I said HR policy change. If I have to do it in my organization, I need to consult, modify at least 5 to 6 times with the community members who are getting influenced and even with the board also. I can't expect that I'll create a policy document and blindly everyone will say, okay, we accept it. the level of consultation, the level of engagement, both internally and with the people who matter above me in a public sector will be far higher compared to the other world out there. So it takes a little more time, Rian. But I think both are very different challenges out there.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
So once more, I want to ask a question.
Yeah.
Why public sector companies are in loss? Is it due to weak governance, like BSNL is in loss at all?
So there are 2 to 3 things out there. Easy, it's like this. Tata Group is a large firm, right? It's a large business group. How many of you are aware that Rallies is part of a Tata Group company, or a Voltas is a Tata Group company? Not many of you, till you possibly see their logo being associated with the organization or a couple of times it getting understood. What I'm trying to say is the chairperson out there, the leadership of the Tata Group out there would not have enough time to spend, enough resources to spend, enough energy to spend on rallies vis-a-vis Tata Motors, Tata Power, Tata Steel, etc., or a TCS, right? In that sense, a rallies will always be a pain point for the portfolio of firms which the Tata Group is managing. Rallis India is a chemical company which is into fertilizers and chemicals. Similarly, inside the government also, maybe it is not the most important thing to address and answer, and hence government is possibly not having enough time and resources and attention to spend time on a relatively tiny unit compared to the gamut of issues at the level of the nation which the government faces out there.
Does it mean that the government should not be dealing with business at all, rather than spending time on policy management and the just management and uh, policy framing alone, rather than doing business?
I think giving a answer here would be fraught with risk, but definitely there is a need for government to focus more on policy framing and ensuring that the norms of the game are created in a very transparent fashion and adhered to in a transparent fashion by the rest of the people playing the game. But to that extent, I would possibly also say that when a sector is not being started or when no one is there in the sector to start a particular business or initiative, perhaps government might be forced to be the to it for the first time. Like LIC, in those days there was hardly any insurance, and in that sense, government said, "Okay, we will create LIC, and we will ensure that the nation gets insured." And now, with over you can say time span of 40, 50 years, with the private sector thriving and some sort of norming happening, etc. I think it's okay. Now it's okay to kind of slowly reduce and force LIC to also move towards certain metrics and get monitored and get possibly in some sense become more efficient compared to what it was earlier.
Definitely, I also align with that.
Even
Once
sir,
again,
can we
yeah,
can we
definitely.
yeah.
I was just expecting some students to open up. If that is not happening,
maybe
I think it's better we stop.
we'll wind up. We'll wind up.
Fine. So I think we are towards the end of the session, and for the delivering of thanking note, may I welcome Ms. Reshma Jose from MBA 21. Reshma.
You're visible but not audible, madam.
Rishma, you're not audible.
Hello, sir. Am I audible?
Yes,
Yes,
Rishma,
yes.
you're audible.
Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of all students and staff of DCSMAT institutions, I am glad to express the vote of thanks. I'm humbled to address this opportunity to extend our wholehearted gratitude to the resource person of the day, Dr. Ram Kumar Kakkani, Director, IIM Raipur. On behalf of DCSMAT family, I thank you, sir, for your valuable presence and expert words on the topic, nuances of governance in public systems vis-a-vis private systems. Thank you so much, sir. On behalf of DCSMAT family, now I thank Sri Reddy DC, Chief Facilitator, DC School of Management and Technology, Bhagaman and Trivandrum, Dr. N. Ramachandran, the Dean, DCSMAT Institutions, Kurajos, the Registrar, DCSMAT Institutions, Dr. Jaishankar Prasad, the Director, DCSMAT Institutions, Dr. Elizabeth George, Principal, DCSMAT Bhagaman, faculty and non-teaching staff of DCSMAT Institutions, and Colloquia Series Coordination Team. Finally, hearty thanks to all the participants of today's webinar. To conclude, let me quote the words of Aristotle. We are what we repeatedly do. Excellence then is not an act, but a habit. Thanking you all once again. I'm Reshma Jones, MBA student at DCSMAT Bhagaman. Thank you.
Thank you so much, friends, for being patient and for being so seated and for kind of listening so carefully. Let me take this opportunity to also thank the management for giving me a chance to be part of this particular engagement. And I hope and wish that you do well. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much for sparing your valuable time and being with our students. Actually, the Dean sir has conveyed his regards to you. Unfortunately, he couldn't join because he was traveling.
Yeah,
He said he'll be calling you.
yes, ma'am. Right.
Yeah,
Thank you.
you
Thank you.
so much, sir. Yeah.
Right. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. Thank you, sir. Neeraj, sir. Thank you.
Tremendous session, sir.